This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Beginning today's show is K-State law professor Roger McEowen with recent changes impacting agricultural law. He discusses amendments to the waters of the United States and revisions to I-9 Forms. K-State weed management specialist Sarah Lancaster continues the show by sharing a few things producers should think about for weed control this time of year. The Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts concludes today's show. K-State's Brad White, Bob Larson, and Brian Lubbers converse about generic versus brand name pharmaceuticals. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show this week with an agricultural law update. And for that update, we're joined with K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. Roger, thanks for joining us once again.
Good to be with you, Shelby.
Roger, getting started talking about a recent article you've written, the EPA finalizes amendments to WOTUS rule. And so can you give us some background about that?
Right, Shelby. We talked about this whole issue a couple of times in the past. This has been one of the biggest issues in agriculture this year, particularly because we've had the U.S. Supreme Court decide a case on what the definition of a wetland is for purposes of the Clean Water Act and jurisdiction by the Corps of Engineers and the EPA. And prior to the opinion being released on May 25, the agencies had actually put out a new rule overturning the Trump administration rule and focusing on the significant nexus test. Well, when the Supreme Court opinion came down in late May, it basically largely obliterated the agency's new rule, which went into effect in March, and said, no, the significant nexus test is the wrong test for determining whether a wet spot in a farm field, for example, or a ditch or a stream that sometimes has water in it but sometimes does not, is subject to federal jurisdiction. That's the wrong test. The test is the continuous surface water connection test. And the court was unanimous in rejecting the significant nexus test. And Shelby, it's very rare in a major environmental case that we see the Supreme Court being unanimous on anything. But they were on this, and they said, no, the significant nexus test is the wrong test. All 9 justices said that, and all 9 said that the Sackett's tract was not a wetland. And so the agencies, after that opinion, I think probably reluctantly so, but had to go back and amend their rule and eliminate the significant nexus test and insert the continuous surface water connection test as the proper jurisdictional test.
So almost a little bit of like a power struggle there between people not doing it correctly?
Well, whenever there's a power struggle between the agency and the Supreme Court, we know who wins that one. The Supreme Court will win that one.
Talking about the Sackett opinion and kind of what we've seen there.
Well, the Sackett's had a tract of land in northern Idaho that was about 100 yards from Priest Lake. Now, Priest Lake is a jurisdictional water of the United States, but there was no continuous surface water connection from their tract across other tracts to the lake. And the government came in and said, well, there's a significant nexus. It's connected to this, it's connected to that flows into Priest Lake. And that's how they claim jurisdiction. And that's what the court said was wrong. That is the incorrect way to determine whether a wet area is a jurisdictional wetland. And that's why this is important for agriculture, because the agencies will not be able to connect the dots with a small wet area in a farm field or a ditch or a stream that often, say in western Kansas, does not have water in it. They can't use that to connect to something else that ultimately flows, for example, into the Missouri River, which is a water of the United States. So this is the Sackett opinion is very favorable for agriculture, but I would remind people that even though we have these EPA amendments and the EPA and the Corps appear to be conforming their rule to what the U.S. Supreme Court has said, that there are still other ways that farmers can get in trouble with the federal government when it comes to wetlands. And one of those is under the Swamp Buster rules. And Swamp Buster completely has a different definition of a wetland for government jurisdictional purposes than do the EPA and the Corps under the Clean Water Act. Swamp Buster involves eliminating federal farm program benefits if you farm what is deemed to be a wetland. And the definition of a wetland there is totally different. So farmers and ranchers still have to worry about that. And that has absolutely nothing to do with what we're talking about here on these EPA amendments. So farmers have to remember they can get caught two different ways with respect to wetlands.
Talking more about navigable water, then that really takes out ditches and drainage systems for producers.
As long as there is no continuous surface connection to a navigable water of the United States, then yes, it would be removed from jurisdiction now under the Sackett opinion.
Those EPA amendments on August 29th, what were a few of those key amendments?
Well, they did several things, and of course the two big ones that we mentioned is that they removed the significant nexus test. That's a big one. And they said that we're limiting jurisdiction over wetlands to just those that are relatively permanent and have a continuous surface connection to navigable waterways. So those are the two main points. So I take from that wetlands which would share a surface water connection with the water of the United States and no longer have that connection due to man-made barriers such as levees and dikes or sand dunes, they're no longer included in the definition of a WOTUS. And so that's what I was talking about a moment ago, where you can't connect the dots. And so if you've got man-made barriers, the significant nexus test cannot be used to connect that wet area to a jurisdictional water of the United States. The other thing I would point out, Shelby, is that these amendments became effective immediately as soon as they were issued on August 29, and they were finalized without the agencies issuing a draft for public comment under the Administrative Procedures Act. The agencies were relying on a good cause exception that is contained in the Administrative Procedures Act, claiming that the rule was sufficiently urgent that they had to get this out. And of course, they were saying that the Supreme Court put them in this position. But I had said all along that they were kind of foolish for putting the rule out in advance of the Supreme Court's opinion, because the Supreme Court could invalidate it. And indeed, they did in large part.
And are there still some unanswered questions, however, within all the definitions and all of this work that has been done around it?
Yeah, I think some of the nuts and bolts issues are still not defined. I would focus on what is a ditch, what are they going to take to be their position from a regulatory standpoint with respect to ditches, and even other farm features that are filled with water only sometimes, such as these ephemeral streams. Are they changing their longstanding definition of those to conform to the Sackett opinion, or are we going to have more litigation on these particular issues? And I still kind of feel that this is not going to be over in the courts. We're probably going to have more litigation with respect to even these amendments.
And Roger, where does Kansas stand on this?
Well, that's a good question, because prior to the amendments, and actually prior to the U.S. Supreme Court opinion, the new rule by the current administration had been enjoined by federal courts in 27 states. So that rule wasn't currently enforced in 27 states. The government could not enforce it, and Kansas is one of those states. And that litigation is still out there, even after the Sackett opinion and after this amendment came down. So I really don't know what's going to happen with that litigation on the rule itself. Those are outstanding cases, and they're paused, and I think their future is uncertain at this point in time.
Roger, then is it fair to say that things aren't settled by any means of this, and probably we'll still have more to talk about in the future?
Oh, I think it'll give us fodder for further discussion in the future. I don't think this is settled, but at least we have a more clear U.S. Supreme Court opinion than we've ever had. And again, we had unanimity on the fact that the significant nexus test was the incorrect test, and that is a step forward.
And talking about changes with farming and things related to agriculture, the I-9 form, which is something important to producers and to farm operators, recently kind of got a little bit of a makeover.
It did, and the I-9 is the form that verifies the identity and the employment authorization of farm employees, and it protects the employer from penalties associated with hiring improper people, such as illegal aliens. So this is what protects the employer, it protects the employee, and it's a pretty important form, and it has to be completed within a short time frame after a worker is hired. And so, and again, this is one area where there's no exemption for ag employment based on size or family ownership of the farm. Everybody is subject to the requirement to fill out a Form I-9. And you're right, a new form came out on August 1. It is mandatory starting November 1. And I would encourage people to take a look at my blog article on this. I do provide the link to the form so they can actually go precisely to the government's source where they produce this form and take a look at that, print that out if they're hiring ag workers. and use that new form starting November 1.
And on that new form, have some of those questions been kind of condensed or reworded to hopefully make things a bit smoother?
They did. In some instances, it clarifies, for example, the differences between non-citizen national and non-citizen authorized to work, and it can be filled out on tablets and mobile devices. And there's a checkbox that's been added for employers to indicate when they have remotely examined the Form I-9 documents. And there have been certain other revisions that have been made, too, and as well as the instructions to the form. Those have been updated. So people need to take a look at that. If you're hiring ag workers, that's a pretty important document.
And just reminding people that that document does have a time limit of when it needs to be filled out once people are hired.
Right. They've got 3 days from the time of hire to complete the form, and then employers have to hang on to the form and make it available for inspection for a certain period of time, too.
And, Roger, for people who would like to go read your article, where can they do that?
You can find it on my blog, and from the homepage of my website, you can access my blog, and that's Washburnlaw.edu/WALTR. The blog articles are also posted on Ag Manager through the Department of Ag Econ at K-State.
Roger, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and once again giving us an update on some things related to agricultural law.
Thank you, Shelby.
That was K-State and Washburn Law Professor Roger McEowen discussing recent WOTUS changes and the revised I-9 form. I will link the articles discussing both of these topics in today's show notes, which you can find on agtoday.net. You can find more of Roger's work by also going to Washburnlaw.edu/WALTR, or his blog posts are often also posted on Ag Manager's website at agmanager.info. I will link all of these resources in today's show notes, which, as always, you can find on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Wednesday show now, discussing some things producers might want to think about when trying to control weeds for the upcoming year. And then to talk about it, we have K-State Weed Management Specialist, Sarah Lancaster. Sarah, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on, Shelby.
So weed management, kind of your realm of expertise here. And so thinking about ahead for the next year of what we can be doing now.
That's right, Shelby. One of the things that separates weeds from some of the other pests that we have to manage in crops is that weeds have a seed bank that doesn't go away. And so if we think about managing the weed seed bank, that can help us get ahead and rely less on herbicides or other tools the next year. So harvest and fall is really a good time to try to get a handle on weed management.
And talking about that, because water hemp and Palmer amaranth, one little plant can make a really big impact.
Yeah, those two critters, those are my job security, I'm fairly certain, Shelby. They can produce hundreds of thousands of seeds per female plant. And so, we're actually still learning a little bit about, when the males emerge relative to the females and that kind of thing. But it's safe to say that if you see female plants in the field at this time of year, if they have black seed on them, that seed is going to be viable. And so there's lots of things we can do to try to, A, maybe make that less of a problem in that particular field for next year, and B, not spread them around to make them a problem in other fields.
So first off, thinking about looking at what's in your field, maybe kind of using when you're combining the time to look and see what's there.
Yeah, so, there's so much going on in a combine cab at harvest, right? It's not, I think sometimes we tease our favorite farmers that they're just up there eating their snacks out of their lunchbox or something. But there's a lot of things going on in that combine cab. All that being said, they have a lot of tools to manage all of that, right? And they can kind of get multiple uses out of some of those tools. A lot of the GPS, GIS types of software and monitors in that combine cab have a pretty straightforward and fast method to just tap the monitor and add a flag or make a note about what you're seeing in that field. And that can help you as you go through records and prepare for your herbicide program, right? So sometimes harvest and that herbicide planning and seed purchasing and stuff for next year run right in together. And so it's a good time to be planning.
If producers are seeing a lot of those weeds out there that they missed during the in-season treatment of it, what do they need to do now for it?
Yeah, so the biggest thing they can do now, if you have the ability, the only way to keep those seeds from going back into the soil in a particular field is to go potentially hand pull them, stick them in a bag, and walk them out of the field. Now, you're not going to do that for a lot of weeds on a lot of acres unless you really have a teenager you need to punish or something like that, right? So we're investigating lots of practices, harvest weed seed control practices. So mills on the back of a combine, things of that nature to help try to kill those weeds before they get to the soil seed bank. Probably the best thing that a farmer can do in terms of weed management right now is to just not spread the problem. And I know that, there's 2 times a year you don't mess with your farmers, and that's planting and harvest, right? You don't want to slow things down at those 2 times. But taking a few minutes to just throw a leaf blower in your pickup that pulls your header trailer or, someplace in a grain truck. And when you move from field to field, you're probably taking that header off anyway if you're going any distance. Well, Shelby, here's where we're gonna say that Sarah's a Missouri girl, and I'm used to narrow, winding roads, not big, straight section line roads. So that being said, folks don't trailer their headers here as much as maybe I'm accustomed to. But if you're taking that header off, it doesn't take that much more time to get a leaf blower out. And really pay attention around the feeder house and places like that where those weed seeds can get hung up and then go, drop off the combine someplace else and create problems. Other things to think about, they can get hung up on tires or axles of pickups or grain trucks or whatever that's also in the field. And so just being cognizant of where you're driving those things so that you're not putting yourself in a position to get them hung up on your trucks and your equipment to move them from place to place. There is a more detailed cleaning routine that farmers can go through if they want to get every last weed seed, for example, if they know they have a herbicide-resistant problem in a field or something of that nature. It does take more time, and there's lots of resources out there to find those. In fact, we did a podcast that really detailed those a couple of years ago, our War Against Weeds podcast, so folks could find that there if they want the details on deep cleaning a combine.
Also a potential thing if it works out harvesting from least weeded fields to the most.
Absolutely. I say that's a simple thing. I understand the logistics of going from, point A to point B in the most efficient route and having to harvest things when they're ready. But yeah, that is a low cost, kind of low input way to try to mitigate that spread is harvest the cleanest fields first and leave those fields that if the co-op missed the application or whatever, leave those guys for last.
And always at the end of the season, clean your stuff well. So hopefully next year you're good to go, clean, fresh, and not spreading even more problems, hopefully.
Yeah, that's right. I am not an ag engineer, but I understand the value of preventative maintenance, Shelby. So, yep, just keeping things clean. That's important.
And Sarah, this is an article you covered in a recent agronomy update. And something else in that update to mention to producers is self-guided tours for herbicide evaluation plots.
Yeah, so my team puts out several herbicide evaluation plots at Ashland Bottoms each summer. And we want to make those available to the public. That data that we collect goes into the weed control guide. It goes into my winter program presentations and things like that. But sometimes, seeing it is way better than hearing about it, right? And I thought, I know a lot of farmers and folks in the industry who come to town for football games, so maybe there's a chance before or after that tailgate or after that game that folks might want to swing in at Ashland and take a look through the plots. So basically, you need to make sure you have your smartphone with you because all the treatment lists are just on a website. That way we don't have papers running around out there at Ashland. But yeah, folks can stop by anytime. In the e-update, the directions are there, so folks can navigate to that e-update from last Thursday and find there's even a pin in that e-update that they can just, if they open the e-update on their phone, they can just click it and go straight to the map. But yeah, I hope folks will stop by because we get to see a lot of things in different ways, maybe than folks that are making recommendations or making sales that the different ag retailers get to see. And so I think there's a lot to learn from those plots.
And hoping for people who stop by to give a little bit of feedback on it?
Yeah, so one of the pages if you open the QR code, there's pages that have the treatment list for each of the trials, and then also just one page, I just ask for like your name, how many people were with you, and then if there's any sort of feedback that they want to give. If they think it's a terrible idea, if they think it's a great idea, if they think we should do something differently, whatever. We're just trying different ways we can think of to get information to the folks who need it.
So for people who are in Manhattan or around Manhattan or coming to it for hopefully a successful K-State football game, take the time to maybe just stop by and share their input for it.
Yeah, we'd love it.
Sarah, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and allowing producers to think about what they might need to be doing when it comes to weed control this time of year, and then also a way they could see some of the work you're doing near Manhattan.
Thanks, Shelby. Always a pleasure.
That was Kansas State University weed management specialist Sarah Lancaster. I will link the resources that she mentioned in today's show notes on agtoday.net. Also in today's show notes towards the bottom will be other links to other resources that producers may be interested in. The first one is a survey that undergraduate research students in the Department of Communication and Agricultural Education at Kansas State University are conducting. They're using this survey to conduct research on the demographics and preferences of Act Today listeners. Participation from every listener in this survey is voluntary and should take less than 5 minutes. This survey is closing soon, as it will be closing on September 15th. Once again, you can take that survey by going to the link in today's show notes. The next link in today's show notes will be about the Kansas Department of Wildlife's and K-State Research and Extension's informational forum that they're hosting on September 21st on baiting and feeding wildlife. This forum is taking place on K-State's campus in the Leadership Studies building. It starts at 6:30 p.m. and you can find out more information about this event by going to ksoutdoors.com or following the link in today's show notes. The next link then will be about the Celebrate Ag Day, which is taking place September 23rd on that day of K-State football against the University of Central Florida. A recent interview has been done with Dan Mosier and Ernie Min, which will also be linked if you'd like to listen and learn more about events and the student summit that's happening the day before. That final link in today's show notes will be about Kansas Forest Service's Seed to Sow open house, which is taking place September 30th. This event is for all families and is free to attend here in Manhattan, Kansas at the Kansas Forest Service's office. There will be tours towards the end of the day that they do ask that you register, and there is a fee associated with it. You can find out more information about this event by going to kansasforest.org. Once again, all of these will be linked in today's show notes, which you can find on agtoday.net. We're now cutting to that short break, and we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Wednesday show with the Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts.
Hi, welcome to Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts. I'm Brad White, joined by two good experts with lots of opinions today, Dr. Brian Lubbers.
Morning, Brad.
And Dr. Bob Larson.
Hello, guys.
So we're happy to have them here because they get to answer your questions. And when they answer them, they will get up to 10 points for their answers. Today's listener question is on generic versus brand name pharmaceutical products, and which do you prefer and why? Brian, I'm going to you first.
I guess I don't have a strong preference, but I do tend to, if there is a generic available, I'm very comfortable with producers using generic products. They're generally cheaper, and they are because the sponsor, the manufacturer of that generic product, hasn't had to go through all of the studies to get that product approved. Basically, they can say if it's the same product with the same other ingredients in that bottle, then it is likely to be as efficacious as the brand product. But it has to be chemically exactly the same in order to do that. But I'm very comfortable with that, and the cost savings are huge for producers. So I think generic products are more than acceptable.
Bob?
That's all true, and a reason why many times you may want to select a generic product. But there are times when a brand name product is going to be really the choice, and oftentimes because if there is a new product, so the purpose of generics, there's a period of time when a new product comes on the market that no one else is allowed to copy that. And during that time period, if you have a unique chemical, a unique pharmaceutical, and really nothing else fits that niche, there might be other generics that are similar but not really quite the same. There may be an advantage of using a newer brand name product where there's really not a generic absolute equivalent out there. So I think it's going to be one of those situations where you're going to need to talk to a veterinarian or get some expert advice about really what are my options for some of the pharmaceutical products. But there's times when a brand name product is probably going to be the choice that you'll need to make.
Good start to the question. And Brian leaned toward generics. You leaned toward brand name. Brian's got 5 points. You've got 4 at the start. Brian, I'm going to ask a follow-up question. As you think about using those generics, there are multiple out there. And so even within that generic space, multiple products, multiple brands of products in some spaces. How do I sort through all that information to make a decision for what's best for my operation?
And Bob said this too, and I think this is always the right answer, is you need to work with your veterinarian, right? And because there's some confusion out there about generic products, and you can get into the space where you get into compounded products. People will call those generics, and they really aren't. So, and you're right, it can be an overwhelming amount of information. But if it's a true generic of a single Pioneer, if you have multiple, they should all be the same product, or at least have shown they have the same efficacy for whatever that label indication is. So, oftentimes we sort by price, or there's some other reason, but really I think you need to have a veterinarian that's familiar with operation that can help you choose A over B because of this reason, or B over C because of this reason, when there's multiple options out there. But if they're true generics, they should have all demonstrated either they're chemically equivalent or they have the same efficacy as the brand product.
Bob, Brian used 3 words that I'm going to have you define: Pioneer, generic, and compounding.
All right. So Pioneer is that original formulation that was a brand name product. All right. And then once the period where they have exclusive rights to that chemical are passed, then other companies can make an equivalent product. So that would be a generic product. So it's a generic equivalent of the Pioneer product.
You got the first 2 right.
All right. And then a compounded product is one where basically you're taking a base chemical, not the same ingredients that the rest of the bottle contains, and you're using that same chemical, but I don't know that the other carriers, the strength of the chemical, it is taking the chemical name that's on the label of either my generic or my Pioneer and making a product, but that doesn't mean the rest of the bottle is the same.
So you have to be sure, as you guys mentioned, you're dealing with the generic or brand name. There are times to use both. Brian ended up with 9. Bob ended up with 7. Thanks for joining us. If you have any questions, you can send them to us at bci@ksu.edu.
That was BCI's Brad White, Brian Lubbers, and Bob Larson. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.